GMOs, or genetically modified organisms, have been around for thousands of years. But scientists have been studying them for just the past 200 years or so. That work has seen some recent major advancements, yet the conflict remains on if those developments are for the better or not. Welcome to Talk of the Town, GMOs, the Knowledge Needed. I'm your host, Mark Schreiner, and for the next half hour, we will be discussing the past, present, and future of GMOs, from their uses in today's society to the everyday impacts they have on consumers' lives. In preparing for today's show, we discussed GMOs with a wide variety of individuals, from your everyday consumer at the farmer's market to the farmers themselves. Now, some view GMOs as harmful substances that defy nature, while others see them as a necessity as populations continue to grow across the globe. There seem to be many misconceptions about the subject, as well as many safety concerns. People want answers. We hope to provide some. Today we will be talking to experts as well as advocates for and against the use of genetically modified organisms. We will challenge them with the concerns and questions that have been topics of discussion for years. It's up to you to make up your own mind and to form an opinion on the matter. Now let's discuss the history of GMOs. The first genetic modification by humans is believed to have taken place as early as the 1850s, when scientist and abbot Gregor Mendel performed hybridization experiments in an attempt to breed different plant species, mainly pea plants. In the 1930s, Russian scientist Andrei Nikolaevich Belozersky became the first person to isolate a strand of DNA, the genetic blueprint of all living things. This led to new discoveries in the 1950s as two molecular biologists, American James Watson and Francis Crick of England, published the first double helix model of DNA, essentially reinventing genetic engineering. In the early 1970s, researchers working at Stanford University Medical School produced recombinant DNA, the first strain of man-made DNA. This takes us to the early 1980s, when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that GMOs can be patented. Shortly after this, scientists around the world, including at agricultural giant Monsanto, began genetically modifying a variety of plants. In the late 1980s, scientists successfully inserted genes into soybeans. By present day, as much as 90% of the world's soybeans are genetically modified to be resistant to an herbicide, making glyphosate-tolerant soybeans one of the, if not the most commonly created and consumed GMOs in the United States. In 1994, GMOs finally made it onto grocery store shelves in the U.S. when the Food and Drug Administration approved the Flavor Saver tomato. And in 1997, the European Union declared that all genetically modified products must be labeled. That's a debate that the United States still finds itself engaged in to this day. Now let's meet our panel of guests. Jill Roberts is with the University of South Florida Department of Environmental and Occupational Health and is also an assistant professor at the USF College of Public Health. Vicki Moss is a civil and environmental engineer with the Political Action Committee, Label GMO Florida. Joseph Dorsey is the Director of Food Sustainability and Security with the USF Patel College of Global Sustainability. And finally, Esther Grandel is with GMO-free Tampa Bay. Jill, let me start with the basic first question, which is, let's have a definition of genetically modified organisms.
Okay, so genetically modified organism is something that's usually made in the laboratory. So you make a change to an organism. It could be a plant, an animal, a microorganism, and we can even do this in humans now, by changing the genome. So you might add a gene, you might delete a gene, or you may just turn a gene on or off.
Okay. Joseph, when we're speaking specifically about genetically modified food, what's the difference when we're looking at genetically modified food and organic food? I mean, is there a differential in terms of the label?
Well, the organic food is basically food the way it was naturally, grown, or the way nature intended it to be. The genetic modified food is, of course, like Jill says, something that's been manipulated in a laboratory to come up with some traits that can increase, yield, productivity, or make it resistant to pests or weeds, something to that effect. So it's been modified in order to enhance, hopefully, its properties, whereas organic is much more natural.
Okay. Yeah. Esther, what lessons have we learned from the history of GMOs that you think can help us define where we are now?
Imagine if you're in a relationship with someone for 20 years and you find out that they were keeping secrets from you, okay, and they were, they weren't telling you the truth, or they were paying someone to keep secrets from you. It's sort of how I think about GMO technology. Is it was fraudulently entered into the food supply in the mid-90s. So the way I look at it is just the foundation of how it was entered into the food supply has caused consumer doubt, because now we're realizing that we have been, kept from certain just the truth, or just kind of the reality of the situation. And consumers want transparency, just like you would in any relationship. You just want transparency. So our food is contaminated with weed killer. Our drinks, our feminine hygiene products, our breast milk, our water, our rain. And as a mother, that's a concern for me.
Vicki, do you think there are better alternatives to GMOs when it comes to farming produce, particularly on this mass level?
We have a long history with food on this planet, and we have never had, the issues that we have today with crops failing and the use of the pesticides in our food now.
Jill, let me ask you then as well, what are some of the things you think that we've seen from the history of GMOs that, that have helped us define where we are now?
I think defining where we are right now has come to some misunderstandings about GMOs. For example, I think people think that when you have a GMO crop, it's drenched in pesticides, and this just isn't true. I think that we have come to not understand the definition of a GMO, not understand the difference between pesticides that are used in genetically modified crops as opposed to those that are used in organic, to not understand all the uses that are potentially can be done with GMOs. I think we tend to think of GMOs as nothing more than corn and soy, when there's so much more that's actually out there. There's so many drugs that could be made. There are many improvements to crops that could be made. We tend to talk so much about the pesticides as a concern, rather than thinking about the papaya industry that was saved by making genetically modified papaya, about bananas that we're going to lose if we don't genetically modify them. So there's a lot of strengths in GMOs that we tend to underestimate.
We'll get back to the discussion shortly, but first we talk to people to find out what they think and what they think they know about GMOs.
I asked people, do you know what they used to call, what they called organic farming 40 years ago? And people say, no, what did they call it? I said they called it farming.
A GMO is a genetically modified organism.
GMO honestly means something that I shouldn't be putting in my body.
A process where they alter the seed to make it more resistant.
Food that's kind of natural, like an apple, is modified. Something about it is modified to typically keep fresher on the shelves longer.
Making a new kind of food that we don't know very much about in terms of longevity and effectiveness.
Maybe in one little small area in a lab, in a controlled lab, that can be beneficial for some things, maybe medically.
I think they're very good, especially because they help with malnutrition, especially in third world countries, and I think they're essential for life.
I really think long term it's a little scary because we don't really know if they are okay or the effects, so I prefer to stay away.
Not when it's released into the environment that already has its own genetic system going on.
I do eat them. I never really thought about what the consequences of them would be.
I don't know when I get them because I don't read on the back of the package, but they're in everything.
I mean, if it's better than the original, then it's okay.
Now, polls by the Pew Research Center show that a minority of adults, about 37%, say that eating genetically modified foods is generally safe. 57% say that they're unsafe for consumption, and roughly 2/3 of adults say that scientists do not clearly understand the health effects. Now I'm going to open this up to everyone, but we'll start Joseph. Why do you think the numbers are skewed this way?
I think it's because people are not always aware of what GMOs are and the implications of using them or consuming them. And it is a risky aspect of the GMOs, but I think the public needs to be more educated, and I think labeling is a good way to have people decide whether they want to consume GMO products or not. I noticed there's some labeling taking place, and sometimes there's like no non-GMO is labeled on a product. I think the more public is aware, the better decisions they can make, because GMOs are not going to go away. As much as some of us would like them to go away, it's here to stay. It has benefits. Some of them do and some don't. But I think the public needs to be much more aware of what they are and how it affects them, and then they can make their own decisions.
Yeah, well, Jill, we're going to get into the labeling in just a moment, but yeah, why do you think the numbers are that way, particularly with, kind of your opinion being a little bit on, at least the numbers more, strongly favoring your opinion?
Primarily due to the fact that actually more and more people are becoming aware of GMOs in their food. As she's saying, they got snuck in at the beginning, and now that people are finding out about they're in there, they question what it is. So they, like me, I found out about 10 years ago, and I questioned it and I researched it, and I have a pretty strong science background, so my research said these should not be into our food supply until we have a little better grasp of genetics, because we can turn on and off genes, but we do not know in the gene sequencing how many other things are being turned on and off by manipulating one gene. So we don't.
I would disagree with that. In fact, in a gene array, we know exactly that. So when we do make a genetically modified organism and we change a gene and we turn a gene on or we turn a gene off, we can do a simple gene array. This is inexpensive and done in labs all the time to look and see whether downstream or upstream gene expression is changed by changing a single gene. And so although I think the public does a lot of confusion about GMOs, and maybe the lack of transparency has been a big issue, I think a lot of it is misunderstanding. That people don't understand the reason that the scientists, and you can look at the polls of the AAAS scientists, 98% of them think GMO foods are safe. That's higher than the number of scientists that believe that humans cause climate change. Okay, so that's a huge, huge percentage of scientists. Why do we think that? Is because we don't believe that any significant change was made in the food that has a downstream effect on humans. And the studies support that.
I disagree with that. The technology, once it's released, it's not able to be controlled. So even if it does have benefits, they can't control it once it's released because bees pollinate, and then they're going to go spread it and contaminate farms that don't want to grow GMOs. So what about the neighboring farmer who doesn't want to grow GMOs, who doesn't want to use Roundup? The technology's been released, and he doesn't have a choice. He's going to have a contaminated, a property. And so even if you do see benefits, controlling the technology has not, that's a problem. It's a problem for people who are now, they're organic farmers, and now they're getting their honey tested and it's coming back contaminated. It's like, how do you explain that away? They don't want to have GMOs. They didn't ask, they didn't buy it, they don't want their bees exposed to it, but now they're having to, deal with the financial losses of that also.
And the organic industry has exploded in the past 5-10 years, and people are looking for organics, and they want organics, but with the fact that you have cross-pollination, seeds blowing off a truck and growing in the farmer's field that was organic. So trying to maintain your organic status with an unregulated biological cross-contaminations,
kind of world around you,
it's very hard, and they cannot control the bee going in and out of different fields. They can't control the fact that seeds fly off the truck. That is the other issue about the GMOs. It's like we never ate products with the pesticides on it. We used to spray it on the weeds and the bugs, but never the actual plant. So now we're actually consuming the poisons that were meant for the bugs and the weed.
Joseph, what is, at least in your opinion, the most important question that scientists have to answer, particularly with the added thought that getting consumers to want to maybe not want to consume GMOs, but at least buy GMOs. What can scientists do to get that to happen?
I think they have to talk more about the risk that it involved, because that's what people worry about, how much risk is there. And if there can be data that shows that levels of risk are not as high as people think they are, that may sway people towards acknowledging that it's relatively safe for them. If they don't appreciate the data, then obviously people can do what they would like to do if they want to avoid those risks.
Labeling is a very good way to help educate the public, because if there's a label on it, most of the public has learned about GMOs, social media and other sources, and that's where the trust has been lost. They're not transparent about them being in there, and they're saying, well, why won't they just label them? So we do know or don't know, we do know that they're in or not in the product. So if we can put a label on it, people can now know it's no longer a secret. The non-GMOs are putting it on there. Nobody labels it a GMO here in the States because it's not required.
Right, and that's the thing, that's the big question, is labeling. It's now required in Europe. What is the big holdup and the challenges you face when you're trying to get this legislation passed?
Lobbying from the junk food industries, from
Grocers Association.
Our elected officials are being paid tens of thousands of dollars to not listen to what consumers want. And the Cornucopia Institute has a voter's guide. I encourage people who are interested in food policy to go to cornucopia.org and look at the voter's guide and see how their elected official voted. QR codes just passed. So now a person with a smartphone can scan in the grocery store to see if the food is a GMO. But what if they don't have a smartphone? Yeah, what if they're elderly? What if they are below the poverty line and don't have a smartphone? I have never in my life used a QR code scanner while I'm grocery shopping. So it's not transparency, but they have the choice to label, they have the choice to do a QR code or use a symbol. And I'm asking for companies to be transparent, and those companies are going to benefit.
But I would argue that those labels are meaningless.
Why?
Labels on food are important when they're for nutrition and they're for their food safety. And GMOs is neither of those things. We have a very, very detailed nutrition label that appears on food that tells a consumer things that are related to their health. You need to know how much sugar you're eating. You need to know how much salt you're eating. You need to know how much calories you're eating. There has been study after study that shows GMOs have no effect on your health. So what is the consumer gaining from knowing that the food is GMO? And many people will say, well, they can't avoid it if it's not labeled. It's not true, because you can buy organic. Genetic modification is prohibited in organic. So what did we gain from putting that label is not clear. That's why many of the regulatory agencies have been against it. They said, we've got very clear labels. This has a risk for allergy, we're going to label it. But why saying the farming technique? It's irrelevant.
It's very important to label it, because if you have a GMO, most likely you have glyphosate or some other herbicide, pesticide that's been applied to it. So if there's a GMO in that product, there's also toxic pesticides in that product. I want to know that.
Pesticides are fully allowed in organic foods. Synthetic pesticides are not. Natural pesticides most certainly are, and many of those products are toxic.
Chemical warfare products developed, trickled down into glyphosate. And the DDT that was originally put out there and sprayed on everything got banned later on after we realized how many repercussions of it.
DDT was
but it took
bioaccumulative and persistent toxin. It was
40
replaced
years
with glyphosate,
to get
which is
it
neither
out
of the
system.
above, and it breaks down in sunlight.
But glyphosate
DDT?
started as a pipe descaler.
No, they've had to rework
And all of those
that label.
products started
They
out with
originally
water
said
in
it
them
was.
too. That's pointless.
They originally
the
said it was
derivative
breaking
is what's
down.
important. The toxicity of the end point is what's important. If you look at your own side of things from Environmental Working Group, every single year they post a list of foods that have the most pesticides in them.
As she has said
Which
before.
food is not on there? Corn. Glyphosate is used for GMO corn. We've covered this over and over again, but corn is not on the list every single year because glyphosate is not persistent, it's not bioaccumulative, it breaks down in the environment, and very, very few people believe it has the potential to do damage.
Okay. Let's hear what an organic farmer has to say about how GMOs affect his livelihood.
So I work at Sweetwater Organic Community Farm in Town and Country, Florida. What does GMO mean to me? It means nature's not good enough and we need to tinker with it. It most certainly affects me professionally. Being a certified organic farm, it's quite crucial. People are buying in and supporting this farm to get away from genetically modified things. And in this case, if someone comes to this farm and asks me, how do I know that's not GMO? I can literally show them where I get my seed stock and then everything that I'm doing to it while it's growing in the field to ensure that nothing has been modified from the beginning, from seed to harvest, from the beginning to end.
Well, now we see how this affects farmers like Travis Hansen. Joseph, can you tell us maybe some of the benefits that an industrial farmer would face going forward with GMO-related crops instead, some of the benefits?
Well, I think there's also some alternatives that one could do as far as industrial farming. You know, we talked about organic farming as well as GMOs, but I thought another one that could be hydroponics. Hydroponics is growing crops with aqueous liquid solution rather than soil, and in the time of climate change we have to be cognizant of the difficulties of maybe soil growing if you have drought conditions or you have flooding and so forth. So I think vertical farming and hydroponics is a good alternative that industrial farmers could do to avoid maybe GMOs as well, because we talked about ways of doing that. You don't need GMOs if you're going to be doing aqueous farming as well.
Okay. What's the difference in going for organic versus purchasing genetically engineered seeds?
Well, genetically engineered, if you're going to pay for the patent, the initial patent could be expensive. The actual downline cost, though, to the consumer, it's much cheaper than organic crops. Now, in addition to that, you have the issue with the yield gains. So if you look at something like GMO cotton, when it moved into India, the yield gains and the gain economically was 90-some%. And so you can see a lot of gain to the farmer in that way, and you can see cheaper foods.
Yeah, and Vicki, she brings up the good point there, and it's always the point that's discussed, is the idea of costs, that GMO foods are cheaper than organic. I mean, or maybe Esther, I mean, either one. When we're looking at that, what's the thought that, how do you make it so that the family can afford?
Okay, one of the problems with the cost of the cheap GMOs on the shelves is the fact that GMO farmers and corn and wheat and soy, they are subsidized. They are subsidized by the government. Organic farmers, on the other hand, we have to pay in order to maintain our organic certification. We have to pay to keep that organic label as opposed to being given money to grow the crops. And I mean, on the news lately, they've had people dumping milk all over the place because they had too much. That's a subsidized food, and it gets wasted. So we can level the cost between the GMOs and the organics if we stop subsidizing the GMOs, and so. Please.
You're kind of talking there also about the future of GMOs. Vicki, what do you see when you're looking at the future of GMOs, particularly when it comes to the idea even of labeling and the fight?
I pride myself on being sensible. And I don't think it's fair to tell someone to eat organic and to not tell them how to afford it and to not tell them how to be able to afford it. So I value teaching people how to do it economically and how to make it work in their budget.
Okay. All right. Unfortunately, we only have a limited amount of time. Let me just ask you then really quick, what do you see as the future of GMOs in short?
In short, I think you're going to see GMO crops get more varied and more widespread, because as we start to see diseases that would kill off crops in the past, we're going to have to do something to fight them. There's a breeding project that took 85 years to make an apple that was resistant to a particular disease. We did it in the lab in 6 months.
Okay. We've heard the pros and cons as well as the scientific background behind GMOs. As we said earlier, lawmakers continue debating GMO labeling and other issues, and of course whether the safety of these products can be proven. It still remains to be seen as scientists continue their research. With continued effort from activists and scientists alike, we will have to stay informed in order to make the very best choices involving such a controversial topic. I want to say thank you once again to our panel, Jill Roberts, Vicki Moss, Joseph Dorsey, and Esther Grandel for joining us. This has been Talk of the Town, GMOs, the Knowledge Needed. Thank you for spending time with us. I'm Mark Schreiner.